there were some academics coming out of India and at different educational institutions beginning to start tackling the problem of emerging markets, being relevant to broader communities, and how that could be as profitable from an investor point of view while giving products and services that were yet unmet and still make it part of the business plan. And those ideas began to come together at a time when Fernando and I were revitalizing our foundation, beginning to do work independently on corporate philanthropy, and that began to dovetail into saying, look, instead of having these two legs as separate, why don't we begin to look for opportunities where we can bring a business discipline, a sustainable financial equation, but at the same time address broader needs of society and make ourselves relevant with a sustainable business model to the needs of a broader community. That led to planning conferences where we began to discuss it and led to us beginning to bid for water concessions together with the Metro Pacific Group and starting to address broader communities in a different way. Fernando chairs Manila Water, and that's been just a tremendous model and learning from us. We've often talked about how proud we are of that organization in the way that they touch a segment of the public that traditionally we'd not addressed. And it was great intellectual. It was a great intellectual journey for us as business people to say, here is a new community. We can address their needs in a different way and change the mindset that we had to the way we handled that community and made it a successful business proposition at the same time. It took a lot of rethinking. It took a lot of changes in the way we developed the project, the way we use contractors, the way we build, and led to what I like to think is a very successful business model. And from there, we learned so many other things to address. So a company like Ayala Land, had only one product line at one time, just at the high end, and now it has 5 brand names. Globe Telecom, of course, spans a huge range of different customer groups. It really fundamentally changed the way we think, BPI as well. And it's been quite exciting for us and made us, I like to think, as an institution, much more relevant to the needs of the country. We're particularly proud working with the Metro Pacific Group and Joey and Manny Pangilinan and beginning to help address some of the transportation needs of the country, not without its challenges, but I like to think that hopefully over time we can make a difference in areas like that as well.
Yes, it's not without challenges, and that's what you raise. I mean, you're into public service and the companies that you're at. What to you appears to be the most pressing issue, pressing challenge when it comes to serving the public? Joey.
Before I answer that, I would just like to comment on the way the brothers work together, because I think the amount of trust they have in each other is really special. Anyone who runs a company, whether it's big or small, knows that it is never a single person who can run that company. It's always a team. And that team has to be very clear and not second-guessing each other. And that only comes with trust. And so I think the trust you have for each other somehow cascades down to your managers, and that's why they're so effective and so efficient in the way they work. But as you know, and as we know, the challenges you face in implementing those very lofty goals that you have will often test the mettle of your management, no? And it will sometimes test your faith in each other as whether you're doing things the right way or not, no? Because with social media pouncing on anything that's big, no? Your company, our company is always fair game to everyone. How do you maintain that faith, I guess, is the question I have in my mind, because I'm sure everyone here in this room admires the way you carry this out. And is there a special force that keeps the faith alive, or what?
Fernando?
No, I guess it's back to this issue of respect and the fact that we're a collegial body, we're going to work together, we get things resolved. And we've faced many challenges, as you've mentioned, along the way. We've made bad decisions. maybe the wrong call in terms of a particular way of doing things, but it can get fixed. And I think when we put the minds together and work as a group, we will generally find a solution. I just wanted to touch on the issue of serving a wider part of our country. We're involved with Joey and the MPIC group in the LRT1 rail. It's been astounding to me. So these are two completely separate organizations that come together for a common purpose. We've been able to work extremely well together. We inherited, I think, different sets of trains. The oldest ones were 30 years old. The other ones were 20 years old. They didn't have any spare parts. We didn't receive the number of trains we were supposed to receive. In 1 year, there's already been a dramatic difference. I hope anyone who uses the LRT1 will agree. What I'm saying is that when you get the private sector to get involved with key problems in our country, we can get them resolved. Now, obviously, the private sector has to be compensated. And we are in the stock market, we're there for profit. But you can get involved in basic services, whether it's in water, whether it's in rail, and I do think that the private sector can play a very important role in getting many of these things resolved in our country. I wish we could do more, that the business groups could do more in getting these problems resolved. So I think what has happened over the years, Kathy, is that I guess what you used to think as philanthropy was very limited in scope. You just set aside a percentage that wasn't usually big enough to make a big difference. When you suddenly discover what you can do through business, just by having a social conscience, doing things correctly and properly, and accessing and giving services to a larger segment of the population for a profit, for a modest profit, then all of a sudden the scale with which you can do things is so much larger. And I think that's what's happening to our country.
Let's maybe give an example, Ayala Education. I mean, what is the goal there? Is it to be able to become profitable so that it doesn't take away from the conglomerate, rather than, look at it from a top-down approach when, you dole out some money to fund that unit? What's the goal moving forward? And have you started making money?
Yes. A quick answer is we're heading to profitability there. But in that particular case, we used to be in the BPO industry, and we were seeing that after a certain number of people that could be brought in to the BPOs, we were suddenly, although there were many people around, the qualifications were not enough to meet the requirement. And we realized that with just a few months of extra work for these individuals, we could make them employable, and that they would have the qualifications. And so we said to ourselves, what's missing in the system? Why aren't we training more people at school to be employable as soon as they leave high school? Some can't afford to go to college. If they can, great, they'll go to college at some point. But at the particular time that we were looking at that, we said, well, what is it that we need to do in the high school system or to train people so that more of them can get employed? And that was what then took us into getting involved in the APEX schools, which has a very strong, it has obviously the curriculum. We obviously tweak it so that we can give the best education at a very affordable price. But there's a strong component there that anyone that leaves our schools should be able to get employed. And so we got all our human resources teams together to help us create the elements that we needed to bring into the curriculum to make sure that people could get employed afterwards.
I don't want to be taking away the panelists and the brothers away from the audience. Does anyone have a question? Yes, sir. I may take the question over there, and then yourself, sir, and then ma'am. Okay, do you need the microphone? So we have 4. All right. If you could just come forward, I'll lend you my microphone. Yes, sir, please come forward if you could. Please.
Good afternoon. I'm
Hi, ma'am.
Yes, I'm Digna Rosales, the President Emeritus of the Fashion Designers Association of the Philippines. And I'm very happy to come over because through the invitation of a wonderful human being by the name of Attorney, my lawyer, okay, our MC. But I'd like This is an observation and a comment. I used to work with Insular Life, which was used, Ayala Corporation used to own that until it was mutualized. And I tell you, sirs, the brothers, I had a very pleasant experience with you guys sometime in 1981 when we went to Hong Kong. I took the business class. Your parents were there. But what I noticed, the children were seated in the economy class. And that struck me because that was the value of the Ayala family, which is humility. They touch base with the common people. And I have to congratulate you on that. And since that time, you are very young, very good looking, dashing. Well, you're still very good looking, no? You were I think you were in your 20s, 21, you were 21 and 22 that time. You were a group with your parents. And suddenly I said, this family is great. That's why the branding is great. There were families who came and went, family corporations. But Ayala Corporation will always stand, will always be there, because there is such a thing as love for the country, and it was demonstrated during the EDSA Revolution. I was there with your mom also. So thank you very much. Congratulations to Ayala Corporation, and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Maybe I could lend you my microphone, and then we'll lend Sir his microphone and be the next one.
Good afternoon. My name is Fred Parungao. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of SharePHIL. I congratulate Ayala for the excellent performance that it has done through the years. My questions, sirs, are there surely will be a time when leadership will have to be passed on to the next generation. I would like to ask if you can share with us what will be the process that you would go through in selecting a most worthy successor to the positions that you now hold. And if that process is already ongoing, and if a candidate or candidates have already been identified. Thank you.
I think you have to first divide up the issues that need to be addressed under both governance and executive functions. So on the governance side, it's really a representative of ownership and participation in board-related activities. That's very different to an executive function, which is a managerial one. Fernando and I were both, I guess, we were introduced and we were trained as managers. The ownership issue came later, but we saw ourselves as professionals wanting to build professional careers. So that's maybe the first issue. And so as we transition ownership in the future, I guess one area where Fernando and I pay some attention to is how the governance structures may change. We do have 5 sisters, and we do work closely with them, and we formed a council where we are able to discuss things outside the Board of Ayala, where we can discuss governance-related issues. That's one format, and that will, I think, spill on to the next generation as they take ownership. So that's a governance structure, and that entity, in turn, chooses their representatives to the board of the corporation, and we keep the two things distinct. It just so happens that Fernando and I are the representatives of that family council at this time. So that would be one element, and I think that will lead to, depending on how ownership passes on hands, they will be represented in that governance, and from that community, there will be ways of choosing representatives to the governance side. On the executive side, I think that is less defined, and it's a tighter filter. We have about 24 members of the generation underneath us, and not everybody is interested in business. Those that are, we've encouraged both of us to take independent professional jobs outside the company for at least a couple of years before applying to Ayala. That saves Fernando and I from having to play that first filter. In other words, they have to find their own independent work, And once they do so, and if they express interest, then we're open to consider it. The next generation is given a chance at an internship at any point in their life. That's open to everyone. However, a full-time job requires them to obviously get through their educational skills and then apply for jobs. And that already is a big filter, because normally you end up either in a professional organization beginning to make a mark, and then if there is interest, they start to apply. As far as leadership of the holding company is concerned, we have exceptionally talented professional managers. For all we know, on the executive side, it may end up in professional hands, with the governance obviously having family members. We don't know. Right now, we have 3 next generation individuals, I guess, within the group. They're following professional careers. They're at lower level managerial positions. And it's a marathon run. We'll just have to see if they're happy or contribute or have the stamina that it takes to succeed in business. At the very least, from a succession point of view, Fernando and I take comfort in the fact that we have a huge roster of very talented individuals within the group across many different industries. We have plenty to choose from. Our fundamental responsibility is to the institution, and that the institution continue to survive and thrive. Definitely there will be governance that has family. On the executive side, we will have to see whether family members are up to the task or not.
So does it appear that perhaps it's a non-family member that would succeed you both?
That part hasn't been decided yet, but it's always a possibility. I just wanted to add one other element, which is among family members, it's not just competence that we look at, but character. They will, after all, represent the other members of the family, and so you want them to have the right values and the right personality so that they have the trust of the family members. They also have to gain the trust of the executives. And that also requires a special type of humility and character. So you really try to strike a balance, and you have to see individuals over a fairly long period of time to see if this is going to work. Ayala has become an incredibly complex organization, and the company thrives because we, as we both mentioned, we have such incredible individuals working in it. We have to keep it that way.
Before we get to question at the back, I think Francis wanted to weigh in.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I think I'd like to suggest, I think the success of the Ayala Group is really something we all understand, and there are many questions that there might be of interest. But for our purposes, given SharePHIL and the people here, perhaps the focus I'd like to suggest is in really 2 dimensions. One, the fact that this is a successful family enterprise that has proven the test of time. That's number 1. Number 2, there is a management interface, which really has to do with how do you motivate the best and the brightest non-family members to join the group. So with that, I'd like to ask, you mentioned the members of the panel were given a little blurb before this that really talked about family constitution, and I'm looking at the family side of it. Now, over the last 15, 20 years, family constitutions have become the vogue. The question is, it has not always worked. What I think might be useful, because there are many family-controlled corporations, is to get first your view on what are the really important components in that family constitution, number 1. The second is, you mentioned that not every member of the family who wants to join the business can get to join the business. In effect, that they have to be capable and they have to have the values that you say. The second question is, who makes that call and what are the criteria?
I think, Francis, let me just first say that maybe one mistake potentially that happens in family businesses is mixing up, and I think I was referring to when Fred asked his question, mixing up governance and executive ability. The 2 things are separate. And Fernando and I have spent a great deal of time talking about that and finding out that sometimes there are skills that one has in a governance role that may not translate easily to an executive, and vice versa, and some people have both. It's very important, first and foremost, to separate those 2 things. Fernando mentioned the issue of character. I think that there are many family members who may not have executive ability, but may have unique skills as a member of a board or as governance or as a unifying factor in families. So it's important to divide up those two. I think our forming a family council allowed us to have a dialogue outside the boardroom. The boardroom is a very professional setting, and as Fernando said, the last thing we would ever want to do is send mixed signals in decision-making in a highly competitive environment where speed is of the essence and the need to move. So we created a forum, I guess as a family, where that dialogue as a family group could take place outside the boardroom. And the agreement that we have, I guess as part of that, is whoever represents the family on the board then makes decisions as needed and that serve the needs of the corporation and the greater good of the broader stakeholder group of that community. If there is a problem with that, then the family council can change that. There are voting structures and that lead to representation, Francis, in many ways, in family groups like they are in corporations. And that dictates whether you have a voice or not and how heavy that voice is. And one follows corporate governance standards within that community as well, no? I think, Fernando.
I think the other thing, Francis, you were mentioning what goes into the Constitution. We spent a lot of time in the making of the Constitution talking about what we wanted Ayala to be, what we wanted the business to become, and what we wanted as a family in order to be able to support the organization in the best way. So a lot of it is structured around maintaining peace and harmony and fairness in the family on one hand, so that the business can thrive on its own, and having a sense of purpose. I guess the family, given the legacy, given the fact that we're stewards and want to make sure that this gets passed on as smoothly as it was passed on to us, there's a lot of discussion around that topic, and the fact that you can't have 26 family members running the organization. It'll be chaos. So there has to be a mechanism to select, and that will happen in our generation for the next generation. And it doesn't matter whose child it is. It will be done on the basis of merit, fairness, and with a great deal of discussion and care, because it could make or break a company.
How about our gentleman at the back for the question, sir?
Thank you. I'm Nona Yulo of the Rekindled Chamber of Commerce of the Philippine Islands. This question is addressed to any of the panelists. Our MC, Lorna, mentioned Philippines Incorporated, which is a company owned by all of us. The question, how can we inculcate principled corporate stewardship into those who steward Philippines Incorporated? Or in other words, how do we get the best and the brightest and the most honest of Filipino citizens stewarding our government?
Hi, man. That's a tough one.
Joy would like that. That's a difficult issue. I think we live in a democracy and we have democratic votes and people get elected into public office through that route. However, Fernando, I think, said something quite relevant. It's just a philosophy we believe in. It's not everybody's philosophy, but perhaps all of us as members of the business community, I think there is a role for the private sector to play in the development of this country. One either is allowed to play it or not. As it is, all of us as institutions, we give employment, we pay our taxes. We're already engaged in the fabric of what makes Philippines Inc. And I think that contribution made by everybody in this room is already a very big one. However, I do believe, as a philosophy, and I think Fernando hinted at it strongly, that there is a broader role we can play if allowed to. And there are many institutions that are generally being in the public sphere that perhaps the private sector can contribute to. Now, that's a point of intellectual debate, policy debate. It doesn't fit everyone's view of how a country should be run. But I think within the right framework, with the right checks and balances, the private sector can play a big role in Philippines Inc. beyond the communities that they interact with directly, and can be asked and challenged to address some of the public sector needs. Fernando mentioned education as one of them. We don't know how big it may become in our portfolio, but with some of the ideas that have come out from our group, particularly led by Fred Ayala, I think I might have seen him here. He's the one that conceptualized where we could add value as a private sector institution in what's traditionally been a private sector concern, although of course there are many private schools in the country. I think that's the best way to do it. But on the public service side, I think we do have a democratic system, and we elect the leaders through a process we've all come to accept and respect.
Joey, what do you think? How do you bridge that gap?
Our experience is that there are people in government who listen to the private sector. And it is a question of getting your message across to them, because you have to convince them that the proposal you have or the solution you have is something that benefits the people and eventually benefits. There is a way that the private sector can influence government and change their thinking. So if you have to be patient, and you have to find ways to educate them and to help them get the decisions they need in order to give you the go-ahead.
Could you give us an example? It's such a big company you manage.
Well, for example, we have, as you know, when we took over LRT1, as Fernando said, there have been dramatic changes in the last year. Now, because of that, we were emboldened to resubmit a proposal for MRT3, which was ignored totally by the government the first time around. But because they've seen what has happened to LRT1, they have become much more open. And the experience we had is that after presenting it to them, within 3 days, a technical working group was formed in order to evaluate the technical merits. We've never had this kind of a quick reaction from the administration in the past. So I think that's because the economic team is open to suggestions. And even in the tariff issues that are well publicized that we have with the government, we find that they are open to finding ways to settle it without having to go through a lengthy arbitration process.
Yes, ma'am, Cora.
There was a meeting of the LEDAC in the last few days, and it was mentioned that it's their interest that the issue of federalism be given an urgent fulfillment in the next few months. What do you see as issues that you have to be looking at if federalism is really taken more seriously in the next few months? Are you concerned that this might affect your way of doing business? Or do you see an organization like Ayala doing more in terms of educating the public on the pros and cons of this matter? I think there are many businessmen who are concerned about the issue and how it might work in the country.
Well, I think that moves beyond the mandate that Francis was saying on SharePHIL, but that's a country-related issue. First and foremost, it's very hard to comment without understanding what that federal structure is. We have some pictures of it. The United States has some federal systems where there's a national agenda and a federal agenda. I don't know how it will be defined. I did work a little bit with the Bangsamoro Basic Law issue. I was assigned by President Aquino at the time to participate in the discussions, and they were moving, at least in the format back then, to encouraging a parliamentary form of independent governance structure for the Bangsamoro area, and that's something I think would have been good for that area. It's hard to comment on the federal system for the country without understanding the basic elements of it. It's probably quite a complex process. But maybe, Cora, the only thing I can comment on is that anything that creates a little bit of competition among different provinces of the country and gives them a little bit of independence is not necessarily a bad thing. We run our businesses like that. We don't have a strict command control structure. We like to formalize governance structures that are relatively independent. And Fernando and I play a big role in resource allocation, obviously, in talent allocation, and some of the big business decisions. But beyond that, we like entities that are a little bit independent and that use their own imagination, entrepreneurial verve, and the like to grow with their own governance structure. A federal system could be similar to that, and could lead to some positive impacts. But it's hard to make a deeper comment on it, Cora, without understanding the elements of it. While it exists, we have a presidential system, and there's no reason why that should not work, and it's a system that's worked for many others. So I think in the end, it goes back to something Fernando said earlier. I think any system can work, Cora, frankly. It all depends on the leadership, the governance, and the kind of checks and balances we have, and whether they're respected, and whether the leaders have a way of inspiring people to move forward. That can happen under a federal system, it can happen under parliamentary, it can happen under presidential. I don't think there's a winning solution to that. So in the end, it's about getting the very best people to the top of the public arena and allowing them to lead us. I think that's ultimately what it's all about.
Just going back to corporate governance, as we're on the theme of corporate governance, establishing this culture for corporate governance is still a little bit amiss. I mean, it's just like ticking the box. It's not something of substance when it comes to Philippine companies. So I wanted to know from the brothers how you can actually convince others that corporate governance translates to shareholder value. I mean, what sort of metrics? If we work with numbers, and we do, as we're all in business, does it pay off to be, high up in corporate governance, and you bring in shareholder value at the same time? Fernando?
Absolutely. If you're expecting to attract capital from international sources, you absolutely must have the highest standards of governance, or they won't invest in your company. And that's been seen in many cases. If you can also add one layer to that, and that you now have pools of funds that only want to invest in companies that show absolute responsibility in every way, environmentally, socially, and they're very, very specific. And so again, can you meet the standards of these individuals and these institutions through your own standards? At the end of the day, though, it's not just because you're attracting capital. It really means that you can run a better organization as a result of it. And we genuinely feel that you will have a better organization as a result of those higher standards of governance.
Maybe if I can add, Kathy, to that. I think one element, and it's possibly a point of discussion within your community, is the role of independent directors, I guess, in that governance structure. Fernando and I have been very fortunate to have had a chance to work with some great independent directors across our Ayala group. This may not be aligned to your thinking as an institution, but generally we have found, the two of us, that in order to be productive as a board member, you need some deep knowledge and experience to be able to contribute positively to the discussions. And the two of us have been more in favor, if we can create an independent voice on this issue, on the issue of longevity, really encouraging maybe a maximum tenure allowance for independent directors rather than cutting up too early on, because to add value to an institution, you need to build a base of experience and knowledge, and then be a participant in the decision-making process. And so generally we've both been in favor of following some of the ASEAN models rather than the broader OECD models. But I think there is a role always for independent opinion when people see that you do have that check and balance, and you follow proper processes, and committees are led also by independent directors, as we have pushed hard to do. Then I think it gives a sense of trust that checks and balances and different opinions are heard, and that leads to investors, I think, having a higher level of confidence that even if they're not managing the process, that there is a process of discussion and of checks and balances that lead to better decision making. And in that, I would agree with Fernando that that has its value for the investor community, gaining comfort in that your standards are high.
You do not find an issue with the OECD corporate governance because it's Western in nature and we're Asians. I mean, we're different, we're run differently. How are you managing to bridge the gap or at least customize it for the company?
No, well, we as a company, we follow whatever standards are set by the government. I guess the point I just wanted to make is that we have found independent directors to be a very important component, I guess, of our decision-making process. I guess I would just encourage the fact that we should allow some time for them to build experience within the industry grouping that they're in, and that we've had no problem with that. That independence can still be there, even if they've been in there.
That's why you're in favor of the 9-year limit.
Yes, exactly.
Under the new corporate governance code. I have a question from the audience, someone who didn't want to raise his or her hand. Thank you for this. How would you describe the contribution of independent directors in your boards? Fernando?
Well, a different point of view. And so, again, we at the end of the day, we all want the company to succeed, but they can represent different points of view, fresh points of view. And so the point that I wanted to add, based on what Jaime was saying, is it's not easy to find really good independent board members. And if you have to change them too often, we're really going to have a hard time. We want independent board members that are meaningful and can really contribute to our business. They're good for business. It's not a problem. But finding those individuals with the right skill, understanding very large organizations and the challenges that you face in large organizations, it's not always easy. And so when we find them, we want them to stay with us because they're really extremely helpful. And so they are advisors on the board, and in many cases, they're actually advisors to both Jaime and I also.
Somebody in the audience, whom I know, wanted to pursue the Philippines Inc. theme. Lorna Kapunan mentioned that you should run for Senate or presidency. Let's dream for a while. If you had the opportunity or burden to run the Philippines for 6 years or have the full ears and obedience of the president, what would be the top 3 things that you'd do to get your dream Philippines? Thank you, Rose. Jaime? Which Rose? You want to stand up and be recognized?
Yeah.
Hi, good to see you. Hi, Marvin.
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to build trust in the institutions. I think we have modeled our government under a tripartite system. You've got the judiciary, you've got our Congress, and you've got the executive branch of government. I think that can be very effective, but it's important that those be trusted in strong institutions. So strengthening our institutions would be a most vital one that I think would be key. Number 2, the rule of law. I think it is very hard for any of us to work within a society without being able to count on the rule of law as a basic principle for us to get anything done. And finally, on the third, of course, there's so many points of areas that you can build, is just building a really robust, progressive, future-oriented educational institution. It is hard to build value for a country without overweighting in a significant way the quality, standards, and progressive nature of our educational base. It is what will lead us forward. That should be overweighted and it should be made progressive in order for us to survive in a world that's rapidly changing. With 100 and something million people, if you get that right and can give gainful employment to that community, then you really create something special.
So is it the Senate or the presidency?
If I could just add, Kathy, we have a tendency to just look at our political cycles within those years. We really need to think way, way beyond single political cycles. And we need to make sure that one administration moves seamlessly into the next one and the next one so that there's continuity in the projects. Many of these projects cannot be done that quickly. So we need to have a long-term vision with projects of scale. And at the end of the day, we need to figure out how to continue the momentum and increase the momentum of growth in the country, because clearly there's a lot of impatience, and for good reason, that it's not trickling down far enough. That's a whole combination of issues. But as many economists have told us, probably takes 10 to 15 years of 6 to 8% growth to really make any kind of a difference. If you can get that from 8 to 10, then you'll see a difference faster. But unless those engines are crafted correctly for that growth, we'll never get there. And we'll never see the difference in terms of inclusive growth. So it's a combination of the right plan and then getting trust between government and the private sector and giving the private sector the space to do what they do